Page provides an overview of the Merritt Object Health data model. We have a configuration file that outlines the analysis and tests that we want to run against a set of objects. When we run the build process for an object, we grab everything that we know about the object from our database and we create what we call the build structure. So this is essentially a JSON representation of extracted data about Merritt objects. Next, we run an analysis step in which we build new JSON structures based on computations and other calculations from data extracted into the build structure. Once the analysis structure is complete, we can then run a set of tests and assertions against the data we've compiled in the build structure and the analysis structure. This allows us to rapidly change and refine the criteria for different tests and makes it possible to reprocess collections of information quickly with slight modifications to the test structure. Let me highlight when we run a test, every test will end either with one of 5 statuses. Skip indicates that for whatever reason we're skipping a particular test. Pass indicates a test passed and is conforming to ideal situations. Info means something is less than ideal but probably does not require any investigation. A warning indicates that some investigation is needed but it's low priority. And then a fail means that something really attention should be paid to a particular object. So the first bit of our YAML file that defines our application is a taxonomy of all of the collections in Merritt. This allows us to organize collections by campus, although that's also available as a field within our database, and we can group like collections across campuses into different parts of a taxonomy. For instance, all of our theses and dissertations collections we can group into a group just for theses and dissertations. So when we run our build process, we go out and extract data from our repository. So we start out, we identify an object that we want to process. We have an ID and a timestamp when the object was last modified. This is the starting point for performing actions on an object. Next, we create sample JSON, so we build what we call the build structure. This is where all of the build data will get written. Next, we go out and grab the identifiers for the object. So in the case of Merritt, our identifiers are arcs. And then we have a concept called a local ID, which is a unique ID, but for the scope of a particular collection owner. So we gather that into our identifiers section. Next, we grab information about the containers in which the object resides. So we have information about the collection where the object resides, the organization that owns that collection, what we call the mnemonic, which is sort of our handle for a collection, and then a descriptive name for the collection. We also then group things by campus, and in this particular collection belongs to no specific University of California campus, so we have this in an other category. Next, we gather object metadata out of the database. Merritt operates with very minimal descriptive metadata in our database, so we essentially have the concept of who, what, when, and where for an object, so we extract those fields into this structure. Next, we gather information about the Merritt system files. So these are the files that sort of log the actions that have been taken on an object. If we ever needed to reconstruct an object from our cloud storage, these system files also contain enough data to allow us to reconstruct database entries off of cloud storage. The next section we grab is information about what we call producer files. So these are the actual digital files that are being preserved. So here you'll see we have a path to a particular file, we have a size, we have a MIME type, we have a digest value, and some other bits of information at a file level. And so we've sort of designed this JSON to, ideally make each of these items reasonably searchable for processing at later stages of the process. Next, we compute some statistics about the types of files that we found within the object. So we count the number of deleted files in which particular files were deleted from between an earlier version and a later version. We count the number of empty files that we had, the number of producer files, and the number of system files. We also produce counts of files by MIME type. These are for the producer files within an object. We gather information about embargoes. We have within our YAML file some pattern matching that helps us identify essentially what what we're calling ignored files. So these are files that probably never should have been ingested into the repository. In particular, like thumbs.db files. So what we found is these were skewing some of the results, and what we wanted to do is say these objects contain ignored files, but then disregard those ignored files for purposes of other analysis. And we have the ability to pull some sidecar metadata out, and then lastly just kind of a summary of everything we have for an object at the build level. So everything that proceeds in the object health process does not need to go back to the database to extract particular fields. Now all of the subsequent steps will be based off of this build structure. So the next thing we run is what we call the analysis step. So the analysis performs more in-depth computations about data in the build structure and answers things that a query alone couldn't answer. So let me show you an example of how we have configured the analysis section of our YAML file. So one of the things that we've done is we've provided a categorization of different MIME types and then mapped those specific MIME types to particular file extensions that we expect to find with those MIME types. Certain MIME types that we do have in the repository we're considering to be failures. Other ones we're considering to be warnings. In particular, things that have been classified as application octet stream have been particularly interesting for us to dive into. The next thing we do then is we perform what we call a classification step. So we actually go through and look at all of the files within an object and attempt to classify the digital files that exist within the object and to identify the metadata files that exist within the object. And then we found that we have particular patterns, like our theses and dissertations conform to specific patterns. Things that were constructed from Bagot bags, also they have a very sort of predictable structure, at least in terms of identifying metadata files. So we have a bunch of rules that we follow in order to classify our objects, and we do lots of pattern matching and file name searches in order to make some of these decisions. This is going to be an area where, as we study this in more detail, all of these particular rules are going to need to be refined and refined and refined as we process more and more content. So let me give you some examples of what the analysis structure looks like. So one of the things we do is we look at all of the producer files that exist within an object and then identify MIME types that fall into different statuses. So MIME types we're skipping, MIME types we consider to be passing MIME types, and then MIME types that we have flagged with an info status. Info being, again, it's not necessarily a problem, but it's also not typical or expected. Next, we can identify items where we have a file extension and MIME type mismatch. And again, this is based on our expectations, not saying it's particularly wrong. So here we have found a file with an extension of v2 that's a text plain file. So this is something we might want to look at in more detail. Next, we classify every producer file within an object and come up with counts. So in this instance, we have captured what we deem to be one secondary file. So secondary file in our terminology is it's not kind of one of our primary digital file types that we expect to see. And I'm sorry, the secondary is secondary metadata, and then we have a content file, which is a markdown file. But what we do is we put different files into these different groups. Next, we analyze all of our metadata files and make some decisions about metadata files. Then we count files by our taxonomy of different file types. So in this particular very, very simple object that we're looking at, it's determined that we have one secondary file and one content file, and we have no, we have our classification then is that we have a single digital file. That's our way of classifying the content of the object, and then for the what we've identified as metadata files, we've designated that as having secondary metadata only. We can then categorize our object content based on our file types, which this it looks like I've actually duplicated. I guess this is just providing a bit of a summary of the information that I outlined above. We categorize our metadata, and then if we're able to identify a primary metadata file for an object, we identify that here. So now we have this much more interesting analysis structure. Again, it's very searchable in JSON format. And from this, we can now come in and run a set of what we call our tests. And our tests, let's see. Yeah, so our tests allow us to capture statuses for every test that we run against an object. And you'll see we've got certain patterns: info, fail, pass, these predictable statuses that we assign for every test. We construct a grouping by status, so we group all of our passing tests, we group all of our failing tests, we group all of our info and warn tests. We count our results by status. Again, these are all just designed to make to facilitate good querying and filtering within our OpenSearch dashboards. We identify our non-passing and failing tests. So this provides a nice summary field on our dashboards to sort of provide an overall status for the object. And then we set a final overall status for all the tests that have been run on an object. And then we're able to take all of these structures and publish our results to OpenSearch. From that, we can construct an OpenSearch dashboard that sort of lets us filter and refine and drill down to explore the results of a particular test.